The fire begins at the eastern staircase of the throne hall. It is January of 330 BC, and the cedar beams laid by Darius the Great, some of them 100 feet long, floated down from the forests of Lebanon, take the flame without resistance, as if they have been waiting for this moment for a century and a half. The smoke rises in columns, orange and black against the night sky of the Iranian plateau, visible for miles across the plain of Marvdasht. The limestone columns, 70 feet tall, begin to glow from within, heated past any temperature their quarrymen imagined possible when they first dressed the stone on the slopes of the Zagros Mountains 2 generations before. Alexander of Macedon stands somewhere in that crowd and watches. Most ancient sources, Diodorus Siculus, Plutarch, Quintus Curtius Rufus, report a banquet, a symposium that turned into something else, a torchlit procession through the palace complex that ended with fire. According to Plutarch, it was an Athenian courtesan named Thais who first urged the burning, declaring that this single act would do more for Greece than all of Alexander's battles, payment at last for what Xerxes had done to Athens 150 years before. Arrian, who is generally the most reliable of Alexander's ancient biographers, leans toward a different reading. The burning was a deliberate political decision, a signal. Persia was finished, its symbolic heart was gone. But whatever happened in those hours, the result is the same. The audience hall of Xerxes, the Apadana, with its 72 columns and its reliefs of 23 subject nations, the treasury with its gold and lapis lazuli, all of it. The plaster and pigment painted over the stone blacken and peel. The women of the royal household and the servants and the craftsmen who still live within the walls of Persepolis watch the sky turn the color of a wound. Somewhere in that smoke an empire of 250 years ends. What follows is its story. The world Cyrus is born into is older than memory. On the broad floodplain between the Tigris and the Euphrates, civilization has been at work for more than 3,000 years before his birth. The cities of Sumer, Ur, Uruk, Nippur, rose and fell and rose again, their temples rebuilt on the ruins of older temples. Akkad came after Sumer, and then Babylon after Akkad. And after Babylon, the kingdoms of Assyria pressed down from the north with organized brutality, burning cities, deporting populations, inscribing their victories in graphic detail on palace walls, so that every visitor. By the 7th century BC, the world of the ancient Near East has settled into a rough equilibrium. Assyria, at its height under kings like Sennacherib and Ashurbanipal, controls a territory stretching from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt. In the mountains to the northeast, a confederation of Iranian-speaking peoples called the Medes has coalesced into something that looks more and more like a kingdom. In Anatolia, the kingdom of Lydia controls the crossroads between east and west. The Iranian plateau is itself an ancient place, threaded with trade routes that move lapis lazuli from Afghanistan westward to Mesopotamia, copper from Cyprus eastward. The plateau sits high, most of it above 4,000 feet, and the climate is harsh, baking summers, bitter winters, and the constant wind off the Zagros that strips the thin soil from the land. The Persians in the 7th century BC are a subordinate people within the Median Confederation. They occupy a territory called Parsa, roughly modern Fars province in southwestern Iran, ruled by a local dynasty, the Achaemenids, who acknowledge the suzerainty of the Median kings, pay tribute, supply soldiers. They are clients, not rulers. The Medes had come to power through one of the great upheavals of the ancient world. In 612 BC, a Median king named Cyaxares formed an alliance with Babylon, and together they destroyed Nineveh, capital of the Assyrian Empire, in a campaign of such thoroughness that the city would never again be meaningfully inhabited. Its empire was divided between Babylon and Media. The Median kingdom that emerged was centered at Ecbatana, modern Hamadan in the Zagros Mountains, wealthy, sophisticated, a power to be reckoned with. Into this world, around 600 BC, the birth of Cyrus is wrapped in legend, and the legends are worth knowing even where they cannot be taken literally, because they tell us what later generations wanted to believe about him. Herodotus, our most detailed source for this period, records the account as he received it, probably a mixture of Persian oral tradition and Greek elaboration, and what he records is a story that belongs to the category scholars call the exposed infant, the child of royal blood who must be killed, who is instead saved, who grows up in obscurity and returns to claim what is his. According to Herodotus, the Median king Astyages had a daughter named Mandane. He gave her in marriage to a Persian named Cambyses, a relatively minor king in the south, because the Magi had warned him that a son of Mandane would one day rule all of Asia in his place. A subsequent dream, in which a vine grew from Mandane's womb and spread until when Mandane gave birth to a son, Astyages instructed his chief advisor, a man named Harpagus, to take the infant and kill him. Harpagus, reluctant to commit what he felt was a sin, passed the task to a royal herdsman whose wife raised the child as her own. The boy grew up in the hills of Persia. His name was Cyrus. The historical core beneath the legend may be simply that Cyrus was a prince of the Achaemenid line who spent his youth at the Median court as a form of hostage guarantee. What we know with more certainty is the sequence of events that followed. By 553 BC, Cyrus is the king of Parsa, and by that year he is already in revolt against his Median overlord. The causes are disputed. Some ancient sources suggest personal grievance, some suggest political calculation, some suggest the Persians simply saw their moment. Astyages was apparently not. In 550 BC, the armies met at a site scholars associate with Pasargadae, in the broad valley of the Pulva River in modern Fars province. What decided the battle was not fighting, but defection. Harpagus, the very man who had been ordered to kill Cyrus as an infant, turned to the Persian side and took a large portion of the Median army with him. Astyages, abandoned by his general, was captured. He would live out his days in Persian custody, treated with some dignity. He was, after all, Cyrus's grandfather, but his kingdom was finished. Cyrus rode into Ecbatana, and the Median Empire became the Persian Empire. The Babylonian Chronicle, that meticulous administrative record kept by the priests of Marduk, notes the event without sentiment. In a certain year, the king of Anshan marched against the king of the Medes. It does not tell us what the sunset looked like over Ecbatana on the night Cyrus entered the city. The first great test of Cyrus as a conqueror comes from the west, and it comes in the form of a man whose name had become synonymous with wealth in the Greek world. Croesus, king of Lydia, ruled from his capital at Sardis on the western edge of Anatolia, a city famous for the river Pactolus that ran through it carrying gold dust from the mountains above. It was this gold that gave the world its first true coinage, electrum coins stamped with the Lydian lion, and that gave the Greek language the phrase rich as Croesus, a formulation that still carries meaning 26 centuries later. Croesus watched the rise of Cyrus with understandable anxiety. The Medes had been his neighbors. Their shared border ran along the Halys River in what is now central Turkey. Now the eastern partner in their arrangement was gone, replaced by an unknown quantity from Persia. Croesus, being cautious after the fashion of a man who has enough gold to afford caution, consulted the oracle at Delphi, which reportedly told him that if he crossed the Halys and made war on Persia, a great empire would be destroyed. Croesus was delighted. He apparently did not stop to consider which empire the oracle meant. He crossed the Halys in 547 BC and engaged Cyrus at a battle near Pteria, a city whose exact location remains disputed by modern scholars. The engagement was indecisive. Croesus withdrew his troops back towards Sardis, sent messages to his allies, Egypt, Babylon, Sparta, requesting that they gather their armies for a renewed campaign in the spring. Cyrus did not wait for spring. He followed Croesus across the plateau with a speed the Lydian king evidently did not expect, and the armies met again on the plain outside Sardis. Herodotus describes a striking tactical moment. Lydian cavalry horses, which had never encountered camels before, panicked at the smell and became uncontrollable. The famous Lydian cavalry was neutralized before the battle was fairly joined. After 14 days of siege, the city fell. What happened to Croesus himself is one of the unresolved questions of ancient history. Herodotus gives us a vivid scene. Cyrus orders Croesus burned alive on a great pyre. The flames rise. Croesus calls out 3 times the name of Solon. the Athenian lawgiver who had visited his court and warned him that no man should be counted happy until he is dead. Cyrus, struck by this strange dignity, relents. A sudden rainstorm extinguishes the pyre. Croesus, spared, becomes an advisor. Most modern scholars are skeptical of this rescue. The likely outcome, they suggest, is that Croesus died on the pyre. The Cyrus cylinder, which we will encounter when Cyrus enters Babylon, makes no mention. What is certain is the outcome. Lydia was absorbed, its gold became Persian gold, and the Ionian Greeks of the Anatolian coast, who had been either allied with or tributary to Lydia, now found themselves subjects of Persia. It was the beginning of a relationship between Persia and Greece that would define the next century and a half of Mediterranean history. The greatest prize of the ancient world was not Lydia, it was Babylon, the city that had dominated Mesopotamian civilization for more than 1,000 years, that had been ruled by Hammurabi, that had conquered Jerusalem and carried the Jews into exile, sat astride the Euphrates about 50 miles south of modern Baghdad. In the mid-6th century BC, it was still the largest and wealthiest city on earth, its walls wide enough, Herodotus writes, for 2 4-horse chariots to pass each other on top. In 539 BC, its king was Nabonidus, and Nabonidus was, by the He was not Babylonian by heritage. He had an intense personal devotion to the moon god Sin that his Babylonian subjects found eccentric and his priests found threatening. He had spent years of his reign absent from Babylon, living at the oasis city of Tema in what is now northwestern Saudi Arabia. During his absence, the New Year festival, the Akitu, the ceremony in which the king annually grasped the hands of the statue of Marduk and renewed his divine mandate, could not be celebrated properly. The priests of Marduk were furious. The people were uneasy. This is the context in which Cyrus arrived. The military events of 539 BC are relatively straightforward. Persian forces swept into Babylonian territory in the autumn. The decisive battle took place at Opis on the Tigris River, where the Babylonian forces were defeated. Then, on October 12th or 13th of 539 BC, the Babylonian Chronicle gives us the dates with remarkable precision. Cyrus's general Akbaru entered Babylon itself. Herodotus gives a more dramatic version. According to him, Cyrus diverted the Euphrates, reducing its level so that his soldiers could wade along the riverbed under the city walls and enter through the water gates, which had been left open because the Babylonians were celebrating a festival. Modern archaeology suggests a more prosaic sequence, a military victory followed by organized surrender. But the image of the river retreating from its ancient course, the great city opening itself from beneath, has a power that historical precision cannot entirely replace. What Cyrus did with Babylon is as important as how he took it. He did not destroy it, he did not deport it. According to the document that would become the most famous artifact of his reign, he restored Babylon's gods to their proper temples, returned displaced populations, and proclaimed himself the chosen servant of Marduk, the god whose proper rights Nabonidus had neglected. He presented himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator, a king sent by the gods to restore order to a land that had suffered under an impious ruler. This document is the Cyrus cylinder, discovered in 1879 in the ruins of Babylon, and now held in the British Museum in London. It is a baked clay cylinder approximately 9 inches long, inscribed in Akkadian cuneiform, one of the most studied texts from the ancient world, written in the Babylonian literary tradition, invoking Marduk rather than the Persian god Ahura Mazda. It describes how Marduk searched all the lands for a righteous king, found Cyrus, and guided him. Modern scholars are careful to note that the Cyrus cylinder is a piece of royal propaganda, composed in the Babylonian scribal tradition by Babylonian scribes working in the service of a Persian king. It tells us what Cyrus wanted Babylonians to believe about him, and yet the pattern of behavior it describes is real. Across his conquests, Cyrus did consistently refrain from the deportations, the temple destructions, and the mass killings that had characterized Assyrian policy, whether from genuine religious tolerance, political calculation, or some combination of the two. He built an empire on the principle that subject peoples could maintain their gods, their customs, and their local institutions, so long as they paid their taxes and supplied their soldiers. The most famous expression of this policy concerns the Jews. Among the populations Nabonidus had disrupted were the Jewish communities still living in Babylonia from the deportations carried out. Cyrus, in the first year of his reign over Babylon, issued a proclamation, recorded in the Hebrew Bible and the books of Ezra and Chronicles, permitting the Jews to return to their homeland and to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem. The prophet Isaiah calls Cyrus by name in passages scholars date to roughly this period, the only non-Israelite named as a divine instrument in all of the Hebrew Bible. He calls him the Lord's anointed, his shepherd. Whatever Cyrus thought of such titles, he would not have objected. He collected identities the way the Euphrates collected silt. Everything that gave him legitimacy to rule was useful. Cyrus died around 530 BC, probably in battle on the eastern frontier, possibly. He was buried at Pasargadae in a tomb that still stands in the plain of Marvdasht, a simple limestone structure on a platform of 6 steps, small almost to the point of modesty for a man who had built the largest empire the world had yet seen. Alexander of Macedon would visit that tomb 200 years later and order it repaired and guarded. The man who inherited this empire was not prepared for it in any obvious way. Cambyses II, the eldest son of Cyrus, had served as his father's regent in Babylon, and the accounts that survive of his decade of rule, 530 to 522 BC, are dominated by stories of erratic behavior and sacrilege that are difficult to assess with any confidence because they come almost entirely from Greek and Egyptian sources that had specific reasons to portray him as a madman. His greatest military achievement was the conquest of Egypt. Egypt had not been conquered by a foreign. Cambyses organized the campaign with thorough preparation. He secured naval support from the island of Samos, recruited Greek mercenaries, and enlisted Arab tribes who could supply water and camels across the Sinai Desert. The decisive engagement was the Battle of Pelusium in the spring of 525 BC at the fortified city guarding the eastern approaches to the Nile Delta. The Persian victory was decisive. By summer, all of Egypt was in Persian hands. Cambyses was crowned pharaoh, took Egyptian titles, performed Egyptian rituals. An Egyptian priest named Uja Horesnet, who served as a collaborator and advisor to the Persian occupation, left an autobiographical inscription that is one of our most valuable sources for this period, precisely because it comes from an Egyptian perspective. Herodotus describes him stabbing the sacred Apis bull, the living incarnation of the Egyptian god Ptah, in a fit of rage, then conducting a series of increasingly deranged acts. The desecration of tombs, the murder of his own brother, the burial of 11 Persian noblemen alive. He describes Cambyses sending an army of 50,000 men to destroy the oracle at the oasis of Siwa, which army was then swallowed entirely by a sandstorm and never seen again. Modern scholarship views almost all of this with deep skepticism. Egyptian sources from the period, the Apis stele, the administrative records, show no evidence of the sacred bull being killed during Cambyses' reign. The bull recorded as dying in the year of the conquest died of natural causes and was given a full honorable burial. The image of Cambyses as a mad desecrator appears to originate in Egyptian oral tradition shaped by resentment of Persian rule, then adopted and amplified by Herodotus, who gathered his information perhaps 60 years after the events in question. Cambyses died in 522 BC while traveling back to Persia, of a wound to the thigh that became gangrenous. The crisis he left behind was enormous. A man had seized the throne. The Behistun inscription of Darius I would later identify him as Gaumata, a Magian priest impersonating Bardia, Cambyses' murdered younger brother. Whether the real Bardia was already dead when this usurper seized power, or whether Bardia himself was the so-called usurper and Darius' story is the fabrication, is a question historians have never conclusively resolved. What is certain is that the empire was in chaos when Darius stepped forward to claim it. The year 522 BC was the most dangerous the Persian Empire. The man calling himself Bardia held the throne at Susa, and throughout the empire, from Babylonia to Elam to Media to Bactria, regional powers were testing whether the Persian grip had loosened enough to allow independence. Into this chaos stepped a young man of royal blood, a member of a collateral branch of the Achaemenid dynasty, who had served as the royal spear-bearer to Cambyses. His name was Darius, son of Hystaspes, satrap of Parthia. He was probably around 28 years old. Darius's account of his rise to power is preserved in the most spectacular physical monument left by the Achaemenid Empire, a cliff face in the Zagros Mountains near modern Bisotun in Kermanshah province. At approximately 330 feet above the ancient road that ran between Babylon and Ecbatana, one of the most heavily traveled routes in the ancient world, Darius had his victory carved into living rock in 3 languages, Old. Above the text, a relief shows Darius standing before 9 defeated rebel kings, their hands bound, while the god Ahura Mazda hovers above in a winged disc, his hand raised in blessing. The Behistun inscription runs to more than 1,200 lines of text. It is the longest known trilingual cuneiform inscription, for the decipherment of cuneiform what the Rosetta Stone is for hieroglyphics. A British officer named Henry Rawlinson, in the 1830s and 1840s, risked his life climbing the cliff face to copy the inscriptions, and his copies allowed scholars to crack the code of Old Persian. The text tells us what Darius wants us to believe, that he and 6 noble conspirators killed the false Bardia, Gaumata the Magian, in September of 522 BC, that Ahura Mazda then made Darius king, and that over the following year and a half Darius put down 9 major rebellions, fighting. Modern scholarship remains genuinely divided on whether the real Bardia was already dead when Darius acted. What is certain is that Darius emerged victorious, and that the story he told about himself was believed, or at least accepted, by those who had no power to contradict it. Darius proved to be an administrator of the First Order. He reorganized the empire into approximately 23 satrapies, each governed by a satrap who functioned as a regional viceroy, collecting taxes, maintaining order, commanding local military forces. To prevent any satrap from accumulating independent power, each satrapy's treasury was supervised by a royal treasurer who reported directly to the king, while royal inspectors, the ancient sources call them the eyes and ears of the king, traveled the empire assessing loyalty and reporting back to the court. The tax system was Each satrapy paid fixed annual tribute in silver. Herodotus records amounts ranging from 200 talents for Arabia to 360 for Egypt. Total annual revenue has been estimated at between 14,000 and 40,000 talents of silver, accumulating in the treasuries at Persepolis, Susa, Ecbatana, and Babylon as bullion, largely unspent. The Royal Road. Darius formalized stretched more than 1,500 miles from Susa, near the Persian Gulf, to Sardis, near the Aegean coast. It was a system of way stations and courier relays spaced roughly a day's ride apart, allowing messages to travel the full length of the empire in approximately 7 days. Herodotus, impressed, noted that neither snow nor rain nor heat nor darkness slows the couriers from completing their appointed stages with all speed. Around 518 BC, the precise date is debated, Darius began construction of a new royal center in. He called it Parsa. The Greeks called it Persepolis, the city of the Persians. It was not primarily a city in the ordinary sense. It was a ceremonial capital, a place where the empire came to perform itself. Construction continued through the reigns of Xerxes and Artaxerxes I, spanning roughly 60 years and producing the most elaborate royal complex in the ancient world, set on an artificial platform cut into and elevated above the surrounding plain, roughly 1,000 feet wide and 1,500 feet long. The Apadana, the great audience hall begun by Darius and completed by Xerxes, was supported by 72 columns, each 60 feet tall. On its days of use, the great spring festival of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, it could hold 10,000 people. Its staircase was decorated with one of the most extraordinary reliefs in the ancient world, a procession of tribute bearers from 23 subject nations, each delegation Medes in rounded hats carrying cups and bracelets, Elamites with lions, Armenians with a horse, Babylonians with a bull, Lydians with chariots, Indians with bags of gold dust, rank after rank, each figure carved with a precision that suggests actual observation of real delegations. These reliefs show no battles. There are no conquered enemies, no triumphal violence. What the reliefs show is order. the ordered submission of a world arranged around its center, the great king receiving the tribute of all nations. It is an image of power that presents itself as natural, cosmological, the way things are arranged because Ahura Mazda arranged them. Zoroastrianism, the faith of the Achaemenid kings, is attributed to the prophet Zarathustra and built on the opposition between Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, the principle of truth and light, and Angra Mainyu, the destructive. Human beings exist in the space between these forces, capable of choosing Asha, truth and order, or Druj, the lie. The Achaemenid kings constantly invoked this framework. The king acts by the favor of Ahura Mazda. The rebellions he suppresses are manifestations of the Druj. It was a theology perfectly suited to imperial power, and it ran through every official inscription like a thread of gold through silk. The treasury received goods from every corner of the empire: Lydian gold, Egyptian grain, Bactrian lapis lazuli, Indian ivory, Nubian ebony, Syrian cedar. The king sat on a throne of carved ebony and gold, behind a gauze screen that separated him from all but the most senior officials. To approach him, you prostrated yourself. Proskinesis, the Greeks called it, and they found the practice degrading in a way that reveals. But beneath the gold and the ceremony, the century that followed the death of Darius I in 486 BC brought accumulating problems that no amount of ritual could contain. The event that transformed Persia's relationship with the Greek world began not in Persia and not in Greece, but in the Greek city of Miletus, on the Aegean coast of Anatolia, in 499 BC. Miletus was one of the great cities of the Ionian Greek world, a trading metropolis with colonies scattered across the Black Sea and the eastern Mediterranean. It had been under Persian suzerainty since Cyrus absorbed Lydia, governed by a local tyrant whom the Persians supported as their reliable agent. In 499 BC, the tyrant was Aristagoras, who had just made a serious miscalculation. He had convinced the Persian satrap Artaphernes to support a naval expedition against the island of Naxos, promising easy conquest and rich spoils. The expedition failed, and Aristagoras, facing the consequences, he traveled to mainland Greece seeking allies. Sparta declined. Athens, recently transformed by the democratic reforms of Cleisthenes, agreed to send 20 ships. Eretria sent 5. In 498 BC, this combined fleet sailed east and captured and burned Sardis, the ancient Lydian capital, now the seat of the Persian satrapy of western Anatolia. The burning of Sardis was the moment that could not be undone. Herodotus records that Darius asked who the Athenians were when news reached him. When he was told, he asked for a bow, drew it back, and shot an arrow into the sky, then instructed a slave to repeat the words, "Master, remember the Athenians," 3 times at every meal. Whether literally true, the story captures a political reality. The revolt had drawn the Persian court into a conflict that would not end with the revolt's suppression. The revolt lasted 6 years. By 494 BC, the decisive engagement was a naval battle at Lade, a small island off the coast of Miletus, where the combined Ionian fleet was outmaneuvered and defeated, in part because the Samian contingent defected during the fighting. Miletus was then besieged, captured, and its population enslaved and deported. Herodotus records that the Athenians grieved as if for their own city. Darius now turned his attention to mainland Greece. He had a debt to collect. In 490 BC, a Persian expeditionary force under the generals Datis and Artaphernes sailed across the Aegean with a fleet Herodotus numbers at 600 ships. Modern estimates of the actual fighting force suggest between 15 and 25,000 infantry and cavalry. This was not the full weight of the Persian Empire. It was a punitive expedition, sufficient, the Persians calculated, to chastise Athens and Eretria and place a pro-Persian faction in power in Athens. Its population was enslaved and its temples burned, direct repayment for what Eretrian ships had done at Sardis 12 years before. The Persian fleet then crossed to Attica and landed at Marathon, a plain on the northeastern coast about 26 miles from Athens, recommended by the exiled Athenian tyrant Hippias as suitable ground for cavalry action. The Athenians marched to meet them, perhaps 10,000 citizen infantry, joined by a contingent from Plataea, the only Greek ally who responded. The Spartan army arrived only after the battle was over, delayed by a religious festival. What happened at Marathon in September of 490 BC was one of the decisive engagements of ancient history. The Athenian general Miltiades persuaded his colleagues to attack rather than shelter behind walls. The Athenians advanced, possibly at a run across the final stretch, extraordinary for heavily armed infantry. The Greeks sent The Persians broke through in the center but were enveloped from both sides. Herodotus records Persian dead at 6,400, Athenian dead at 192. The Persian fleet sailed south toward Athens, hoping to arrive before the victorious Athenian army could march back, then turned east after a few days in view of the harbor. Darius would not accept this. He began preparing a much larger expedition. In 486 BC, he died before it could be launched, and the task of punishing Greece fell to his son. The name of that son was Kshayarsha, which the Greeks rendered as Xerxes. He was perhaps 32 years old when he came to the throne, the son of Darius and of Atossa, daughter of Cyrus the Great, and by birth he united both branches of the Achaemenid dynasty. He was also, by the Greek accounts, a man of catastrophic judgment, though we should be careful here. He is the villain of Herodotus's narrative, vain, cruel, defeated by his own hubris. The framing through which we see him comes entirely from the winning side. The scale of the preparation for the 480 BC invasion was without precedent. A canal was dug across the Athos Peninsula in northern Greece to allow the fleet to pass without rounding the storm-prone cape where an earlier Persian fleet had been wrecked. 2 bridges of boats were constructed across the Hellespont, the narrow strait between Europe and Asia, roughly a mile wide at its narrowest, using a technology of roped triremes laid parallel, planked over, and ballasted to hold steady in the current. When storms destroyed the first bridges, and Xerxes reportedly had the Hellespont symbolically beaten with chains and branded with hot irons for defying him, a story Herodotus preserves, new bridges were built. Herodotus gives the Persian force crossing. Modern scholars treat this figure as impossible both logistically and demographically. Modern estimates range from 100,000 to 300,000 total combatants, which is itself an enormous force for the logistics of the ancient world. Even at the lower end of these estimates, the army that crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 480 BC was the largest military force that had yet appeared in the eastern Mediterranean. The Greek response was a coalition, the Hellenic League, centered on Athens and Sparta, that agreed to resist. Many Greek states did not join. Thessaly submitted to Persia. The Delphic oracle advised Athens to trust in its wooden walls, an ambiguous prophecy that the Athenian politician Themistocles interpreted as meaning the fleet. The initial Greek strategy was to contest the Persian advance at The first such position was the pass of Thermopylae, the Hot Gates, named for the sulphurous springs nearby, a narrow coastal passage perhaps 20 yards wide at its narrowest, through which the Persian land army had to pass to enter central Greece. Approximately 7,000 Greeks, including 300 Spartans under King Leonidas, held this position for 3 days in August of 480 BC. For 2 days, the Greek heavy infantry in the narrow pass broke every Persian assault. The pass negated the Persian advantage of numbers. Persian soldiers died in quantities that astonished their commanders. Xerxes reportedly rose 3 times from his throne in alarm at what was happening to his forces. On the 3rd day, a local Greek man named Ephialtes showed the Persians a mountain path that circled behind the Greek position. A Persian force. Leonidas, warned of the encirclement at dawn, sent away most of the Greek allied contingents and remained with the Spartans, the Thespians, and a Theban contingent. The Spartans and Thespians fought to the last man. Xerxes, according to Herodotus, so enraged by the losses Leonidas had inflicted, ordered the body of the dead Spartan king beheaded and impaled. He then advanced into central Greece and within weeks had burned Athens. The city had been evacuated in a remarkable organizational achievement, but the temples on the Acropolis, the sanctuaries and marketplaces and houses were sacked and burned. The decisive moment came at sea. The Greek fleet, perhaps 360 triremes, the largest element Athenian, was anchored in the narrow strait between the island of Salamis and the Attic coast. The Persian fleet, larger by perhaps 2 to 1, Themistocles understood that the Greek fleet could not defeat the Persians in open water. The Greeks had to bring the battle into the narrow strait where Persian numerical advantage would be neutralized. According to Herodotus, who notes the story may not be accurate, Themistocles sent a secret message to Xerxes claiming the Greek fleet was in disarray and planning to flee, and that Xerxes could destroy them by blocking the exits from the strait. Xerxes ordered his fleet to move. By dawn on a September day in 480 BC, the Persian fleet had entered the strait. The battle that followed was a catastrophe for Persia. In the confined waters, the Persian fleet could not deploy its numbers. Skilled Athenian oarsmen rammed and disabled Persian vessels faster than the Persian command could respond. The fleet pressed on its Xerxes watched from a golden throne on a promontory, positioned to watch the destruction of the Greeks, and instead watched the destruction of his fleet. Xerxes departed Greece shortly afterward, leaving his general Mardonius with a large land army to continue the campaign. The following summer, 479 BC, that army was destroyed at the Battle of Plataea in Boeotia. The Persian general Mardonius was killed in the fighting. The Persian land army disintegrated. The Persian navy, on the same day by ancient tradition, though this synchronization is probably a retrospective literary device, was defeated again off the Cape of Mycale on the Anatolian coast. Xerxes returned to Persia and never again commanded an army in the field. In 465 BC, he was assassinated by a court official named Artabanus, possibly in conspiracy with his own son. Artaxerxes I survived the power struggle and took the throne. The king who came The empire that Artaxerxes I inherited in 465 BC was still vast, still reaching from the Aegean coast to the borders of India, still drawing tribute from 23 satrapies. The loss at Plataea had been painful, but had not materially weakened the empire's territorial base. Greece was peripheral, Persia was the center of the world, and yet the century between Plataea and the arrival of Alexander is a century of slow bleeding. The wounds were internal, accumulating in the places that ceremony and gold cannot reach. The succession crisis was the most consistent structural problem. Persian kings were polygamous, and the royal harem produced multiple sons by multiple mothers, each with their own faction of supporters. When Artaxerxes I died in 424 BC, his son Xerxes II lasted 45 days before being murdered by a half-brother, Sogdianus, who was himself overthrown within 6 months. When Darius II died in 404 BC, the succession triggered the most dramatic crisis of the 4th century. Darius II left 2 sons, Artaxerxes, the elder, who took the throne as Artaxerxes II, and Cyrus, called Cyrus the Younger to distinguish him from the founder, who was satrap of Western Anatolia and who believed he, not his brother, should be king. Cyrus quietly assembled mercenaries and resources. He recruited Greek soldiers from across the Aegean world. The Greek city-states were full of men with military training and insufficient income, and in the spring of 401 BC, led an army of approximately 20,000 men, of whom 10,000 were Greek mercenaries, eastward from the Aegean coast toward the heart of Persia. The expedition ended at Cunaxa, near Babylon, in September of 401 BC. The 2 armies met. The Greek mercenaries on Cyrus's right wing fought, but Cyrus himself, in the center, charged directly at his brother across the battlefield. He reached Artaxerxes, wounded him, was himself wounded, and died. His army, leaderless, disintegrated. The Greek mercenaries found themselves in the heart of a hostile empire, their employer dead, their senior officers subsequently killed by treachery, with no obvious way home. The story of their march home, northward through Mesopotamia, through the mountains of Kurdistan and Armenia, and west to the Black Sea, was written by one of their number, the Athenian Xenophon, who emerged as one of their leaders. He called his account the Anabasis, the march-up country, composed around 370 BC. For Persia, the expedition's significance was pointed. A Greek mercenary force of 10,000 had marched through the heart of the empire and survived. That the empire was large. The decades that followed were marked by what historians call the Great Satrap's Revolt, rebellions in the 370s and 360s BC, in which multiple satraps of western Anatolia rose against Artaxerxes II. The rebels coordinated imperfectly and were ultimately suppressed, but the pattern was clear. The bonds of loyalty that had held the empire together under Darius and Xerxes were loosening. Egypt had managed to win its independence in 405 BC and defeated every subsequent Persian attempt at reconquest until the brief recovery under Artaxerxes III in 343 BC. The peripheral provinces were restless. The royal court was absorbed in intrigues, harem politics, poisonings, succession crises resolved by violence rather than law. Artaxerxes III managed a brief recovery, reconquering Egypt, suppressing satraps, dissolving their private armies. He was a harsh and effective ruler, and he was poisoned in 338 BC, probably. His son was installed and killed within 2 years. Bagoas then placed on the throne a member of a collateral branch of the royal family, who took the throne name Darius III. It was Darius III who would face Alexander of Macedon. The kingdom of Macedon occupied the territory north of Greece proper, a land of river valleys and forested uplands that the city-states of Athens and Corinth regarded as semi-barbarous. Philip II, who came to the throne in 359 BC, was perhaps the most consequential military reformer in ancient history before Julius Caesar. He transformed the Macedonian army with new tactics, the sarissa, an 18-foot infantry pike that, wielded in formation, created a thicket of points impossible for traditional hoplite methods to penetrate, and a doctrine integrating heavy cavalry, light infantry, and phalangite infantry into a coordinated system where each element supported the others. By 338 BC, Philip had He was planning a Persian campaign when he was assassinated in 336 BC at a wedding feast, stabbed by one of his own bodyguards. Alexander, 20 years old, moved with extraordinary speed to secure the throne, suppressed rebellions in Greece and on the northern frontier, and by 334 BC was ready to cross into Asia. He crossed the Hellespont in the spring of 334 BC with approximately 37,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, well-trained, well-equipped, and led by a commander who combined his father's methodical preparation with something harder to analyze, an instinct for the decisive moment, a willingness to commit himself personally to the point of recklessness, and a capacity to inspire loyalty that none of his opponents could match. The first major engagement was at the Granicus River in northwestern Anatolia. The Persian satraps of Anatolia had assembled their forces on the far bank, and by conventional military logic, Alexander should have waited for a better opportunity. He crossed anyway, taking serious personal risk. He was nearly killed in the fighting, and the Persian line broke. The Battle of the Granicus opened all of western Anatolia to the Macedonian advance. Alexander moved south along the Aegean coast, liberating the Greek cities of Ionia that had been under Persian control for 2 centuries. By late 333 BC, his army had moved through southern Anatolia into Syria, and it was near the city of Issus, in what is now the border region between Turkey and Syria, that Alexander first encountered Darius III in person. The Battle of Issus was fought on November 5, 333 BC, on terrain that favored Alexander precisely as Salamis had favored the Greek fleet. The coastal plain was narrow, hemmed between sea and mountains, and the Persians knew Darius had somewhere between 50,000 and 100,000 men. Alexander had approximately 30,000. The battle was decided by Macedonian cavalry on the right, where Alexander led a wedge formation directly toward the Persian center, directly toward Darius himself, with such force and speed that the Persian line buckled. Darius turned his chariot and fled. He fled, Arrian tells us, leaving behind his royal bow and his battle cloak, and abandoning his mother, his wife, his daughters, and his son, who were all captured by Alexander. Alexander treated the Persian royal family with elaborate respect, political calculation, genuine courtesy, or both, providing them with quarters and all the honors appropriate to their rank. Darius opened negotiations. He offered Alexander all of Persia west of the Euphrates, a ransom for his family, and the hand of his daughter. Parmenion reportedly said Alexander replied that so would he if he were Parmenion. He declined. He was not interested in part of an empire. The armies met for the last time at Gaugamela, on the plain northeast of the ruins of Nineveh, on October 1st, 331 BC. Darius had chosen the battlefield deliberately, a wide flat plain with no constraining geography, where he could deploy his numerical advantage. Ancient sources put the Persian strength as high as 1 million men. Modern estimates discount this to somewhere between 100,000 and 250,000. He had even had the plain smoothed to allow his scythed chariots to operate unobstructed. Alexander understood what Darius intended. The battle opened with Darius launching his chariots, which the Macedonian infantry opened their ranks to absorb and then closed around, neutralizing them. The Macedonian right wing advanced obliquely, drawing the Persian left to extend its. Alexander drove his companion cavalry through that gap directly toward Darius. The great king turned and fled again. The battle continued. The Persian left was routing the Macedonian right. Parmenion sent urgent messages requesting relief. Alexander had to choose between pursuing Darius and turning back to stabilize his own line. He turned back. The Persian left was defeated. By the time Alexander resumed the pursuit, Darius had hours of lead. Darius fled east through Media, toward the eastern satrapies of Bactria and Parthia. Alexander followed with a speed that seemed inhuman to contemporaries, covering in days what should have taken weeks. In the summer of 330 BC, on a mountain road in what is now northeastern Iran, the satrap Bessus and several Persian nobles traveling with the fleeing king decided that Darius was a liability. They stabbed him and left him by the. Or rather, his advanced soldiers found Darius still alive but dying, stabbed multiple times, abandoned in a wagon. By the time Alexander arrived, the last Achaemenid great king was dead. He had been the richest man in the world 5 years before. He died in the dust of a mountain road, abandoned by his own satraps, without a throne, without an army, without an empire. Alexander ordered full Persian royal honors for the body. Darius buried at Persepolis with the ceremony appropriate to a great king. The gesture was political as much as anything, Alexander presenting himself as Achaemenid successor rather than foreign destroyer. He then pursued Bessus into the east, captured him, mutilated him in the Persian manner reserved for traitors, and had him executed. Persepolis had already burned. It had fallen to Alexander in January of 330 BC, months before Darius died, taken peacefully. The ancient sources speak of thousands of mules and camels required to move the silver and gold out, tens of thousands of talents. The accumulated tribute of 250 years of empire, stacked in the cellars of the treasury that Darius built, now sorted and loaded and carried west. And then the fire. Whether planned or accidental, whether political decision or drunken impulse, the result is the same as it was in the cold open of this story. The cedar burns. The 72 columns of the Apadana stand above the flames, too massive to fall, as the audience hall of Xerxes collapses into ash beneath them. The lapis lazuli inlays scatter across the scorched floor. The gold melts. The plaster and paint that covered the walls, the painted images of guards and courtiers and gods that Darius and Xerxes had commissioned 2 generations before. He pushed east through Bactria and Sogdia, fighting a grinding campaign against nomadic enemies who refused pitched battle and drew the Macedonian army into years of exhaustion. He crossed the Hindu Kush. He reached the Indus River. His army refused to go further. They had been marching for 8 years, and the men who had signed up to fight Persia had no appetite for the conquest of India. Alexander turned back. He reached Babylon in 323 BC. He was 32 years old. He had conquered more territory than any commander in history. He was planning a campaign to circumnavigate Arabia when he fell ill, after a prolonged banquet, with a fever that did not break. On June 10th or 11th, 323 BC, Alexander died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. He had designated no heir. His generals, when asked to whom he left the empire he had built dissolved almost immediately into the wars of his successors, the Diadochi, who carved the Macedonian conquests into regional kingdoms. The Seleucid dynasty inherited the bulk of the former Persian territories and administered them through satrapal structures derived directly from Achaemenid practice. Around 247 BC, an Iranian king named Xerxes founded an independent state in Parthia, in the northeast of the Iranian plateau. His successors expanded steadily, and by the mid-2nd century, BC controlled all of Iran and most of Mesopotamia. The Parthians became the great rival of Rome, fighting the legions for centuries across the plains of Mesopotamia, inflicting famous defeats like Karhai in 53 BC, and divided the Near East with Rome the way the Persians and Lydians had divided Anatolia 4 centuries before. In 224 AD, the Sassanids overthrew the Parthians and consciously they expanded Zoroastrianism into something closer to a state religion, built palaces that drew on Persepolis in their scale and ceremonial ambition, and fought Rome and then Byzantium for 4 centuries. They were still fighting when a new force emerged from the Arabian Peninsula in the 7th century and swept both ancient empires aside. The Arabs who conquered the Sassanid Empire in the 640s AD absorbed more than they displaced. Persian administrative culture, Persian literary forms, Persian court protocol, all of these percolated into the Islamic Caliphate and then into its successor dynasties. The Persian language survived as the lingua franca of high culture from Istanbul to Lahore for 1,000 years after the Arab conquest. The poetry composed in that language, Rumi, Hafez, Ferdowsi, is among the most widely read literature in the world today. The Cyrus cylinder sits in a case in the British Museum, 9 inches of. It has been called the first Declaration of Human Rights, which is an anachronistic reading. Cyrus was not interested in universal human rights in any modern sense. He was interested in the practical benefits of satisfied subjects. But the idea it embodies, that a ruler of many peoples can hold them together through accommodation rather than annihilation, proved more durable than any of the armies that enforced it. The Behistun inscription still looks out over the road below, 3,300 feet in the air. The relief of Darius is still clear, the king upright, one hand raised, the 9 defeated kings in their rope, Ahura Mazda in his winged disc above. The road is now a highway. Trucks carry goods between Tehran and Baghdad over a route that royal couriers once covered in 7 days. The inscription is so high that most travelers do not look up. The Gate of All Nations still frames the platform that was once the heart of the largest empire the world had seen. The reliefs of the tribute-bearing nations still march along the staircase in their quiet procession, each delegation presenting its gifts to a king who has been dust for 2,000 years. The limestone glows in the afternoon sun off the plain of Marvdasht, and the shadows of the remaining columns fall long and dark across the stone where the cedar beams once burned. The fire that Alexander lit in January of 330 BC lasted through the night and into the following day. By morning, the throne hall of Xerxes was open to the sky. The gold had melted into the ashes. The cedar was gone. The lapis lazuli and cornelian inlays that craftsmen had set stone by stone into the palace doors had scattered across the burned floor. The columns stood because limestone does not burn. They are standing still.